Hey, this is Greg from the Code Creative, and welcome back to the channel. It's been a while since I posted a video. I've been quite busy lately on several web development projects, but today I have a really nice one for you, all about creating card layouts using both CSS Grid and Flexbox. Also, a lot of people have been writing to me asking about my online courses, which have been closed for a little while now, but they're going to reopen in about another week or two, so check in on that on the site. I'll put the link down below. So with that being said, let's get into the video now. In the world of web design, UI cards have definitely established themselves as one of the most popular and enduring of the UI design patterns. Very much like traditional playing cards or trading cards, UI cards give us a structured and visually appealing way to present information to our users. They have a structured layout which allows for the efficient organization and presentation of content, enhancing the user experience by providing clear visual cues and logical groupings. Now, one of the key advantages of UI cards is in their flexibility. We see them used all over the place for things like news articles or recipe collections or product listings and much more. And they can adapt seamlessly to various screen sizes and devices, which makes them ideal for responsive design. So whether they're viewed on a desktop or a tablet or a smartphone, UI cards maintain their visual integrity and their usability, and this ensures a really consistent experience across different platforms. Now, one of the things that cards also do is to promote engagement and interactivity. Since they have the ability to contain diverse content such as text and images, buttons, and interactive elements, they invite users to explore and interact with the information presented. And this not only enhances user engagement, but also encourages users to take some kind of action, whether that's making a purchase or sharing a post or exploring related content. Now in this tutorial, we're going to focus on two very powerful CSS layout systems, which are very useful when creating cards. And these are CSS Grid and Flexbox. It seems that people often think that you have to choose between either using Grid or Flexbox, one or the other. But these systems can work together in perfect harmony. You see, by leveraging the strengths of both Grid and Flexbox, we can achieve flexibility and control over our card layouts. Like Grid, for example, can be used to provide the overall structure, while Flexbox can then allow us to fine-tune the alignment and distribution of content within each card. Now, I want to make sure that you stick around to the end of this tutorial because I want to show you a really cool trick where we can achieve a responsive layout using only CSS Grid. That is, without relying on media queries. It's a practical technique that really simplifies the design and coding process. So then let's move on now to first explore the anatomy of a card, and then we're going to jump into writing some code. In this section, we're going to talk all about the anatomy of a card. You see, we want to get a really clear understanding of the key elements that constitute a card. Understanding the role that these elements play will help us to structure them effectively. So let's break down the anatomy of a card. A well-designed card is typically going to consist of the following components. This first section we can call the media section. This is really going to be the primary eye-catching visual component of the card. Usually this is going to be an image, but it can be other forms of rich media, like video or animation. Basically, something that grabs the user's attention and provides context to the content of the card. Typically, you'll find this sitting at the top of the card, and it's often the first thing that users notice when they encounter a card. And along with the title, it's the primary element on the card that catches the reader's eye as they scan the page. Now let's go into some of the text elements on the card. Perhaps most important is the title. The title acts sort of as a headline that summarizes the card's topic or content. The title should be short and concise and descriptive. Visually, it's typically going to be the most prominent text element on the card, and it helps users to quickly identify what the card is about. Again, think about someone browsing or scanning the page. The title is going to be one of the main things that jumps out and grabs a visitor's attention. Really, more than anything, the title should be the primary piece of text content that you want to emphasize. Next, we'll talk about text that surrounds or complements the title. This is generally going to be some kind of subtitle or subheading or metadata. Now, in terms of metadata, Metadata are going to be those things like publication dates, author names, prices, basically like little pieces of extra information. For example, with blog posts, you might see category information or info on the length of the post, like 6-minute read, for example. And sometimes metadata, such as blog post categories, can also be used in an interactive way, like allowing the user to click on them and sort by category. Then you'll often see some kind of description text on the card. This is usually a few sentences or even a short paragraph that offers a summary of the content or more insight into the content. Taking a blog post as an example, you might commonly see a short excerpt that's actually taken from the blog post itself. And it's this descriptive text which acts as a sort of preview or taste of what the user will experience once they click through and get to the full article. And then finally, let's talk about the call to action elements on the card. Usually you'll find these at the bottom of the card, and if you think about it, they're kind of the whole purpose of creating the card in the first place, because ultimately you want the user to take some kind of action. In the case of a blog post or an article, this could be something like a read more button. In the case of a product, we might have something like a learn more button or a buy now button, or maybe an add to cart button. Basically, here is where you're presenting some kind of action that you want the user or the visitor to take. All right, in this video, let's get started by laying out some HTML elements and setting up some basic styles so that we can create a container for all of our cards. And we'll just create, for now, the skeleton of the individual card items. So in our index.html file, inside of the body tags, let's start out by creating a div. This is going to be used to house all of the individual card items. So this is going to be like our card container. And in fact, let's give it a class of card-container. And within this card container div, let's create our cards. For now, we're going to create these as divs. And we'll give each of these divs a class of card. Let's duplicate this div. And for now, we'll do 6 of them. What I want to do is have 2 rows of 3 cards in each row. Even though we've saved our index.html file, you see there's nothing appearing in the browser, and that's because we just have a series of empty divs. We don't have any content or text content inside of these divs. So let's jump into our styles.css file. And before we do anything, let's use the global star selector. And we're going to use this to do some CSS resets. Basically, the browser, by default, out of the box, it gives you some margins and paddings for different elements, like heading elements and paragraph elements and so on. But we want to just zero out these margins and paddings because we're going to create them as we go along. The other thing we're going to do in this star selector is we're going to set the box sizing property to a value of border box. And what this means is that if we give a width to an element, let's say 200 pixels, well, regardless of whatever padding or border we set on that element, the total width is still going to remain at 200 pixels, right? So the padding and the border and stuff is not going to be added on to the width of the element. And this allows us to create our dimensions and size things in a more predictable way. Now let's work on setting up the styles for the containing element as well as the individual cards. So for the card container, let's create a rule that's going to target that card container class. And we'll also set up a rule that's going to target the individual card elements. And usually what I do in VS Code when I'm just starting to get some elements on the page, I'll often use this Emmet shortcut. Emmet is built into VS Code. It allows you to do these shortcuts, right? So if I do BD and then tab, that's going to create a border for me. I can do the same thing on the individual card elements. And now you can see here in the browser, it's sort of subtle, but if you look at the top, you can see that there's this black bar. And really what that is just the borders of this container as well as the individual card elements. And so by default, when you have a div, each div takes up the full width of the viewport, or the full width of its containing element, but it doesn't have any height. Right? The height is usually determined by the content inside of the div. We haven't given any text content to any of these divs, and that's why it appears flat like this. So we're going to replace some of these things later, But for now, to start setting up our grid, we're going to explicitly just set an arbitrary height on these individual cards. We'll set them to 200 pixels. And immediately you can see now in the browser we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 cards. Each one of them are divs. And divs are block level elements, so they span the full width of their container, and they stack one on top of the other. Now, because we're trying to create this card layout, what I'd like to do is I'd like to create 2 rows of 3 cards in each. And that's very common to see in a card layout. When you're viewing a site full screen, you'll usually see 3 or 4 cards laid out in each row. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to lay out 3 cards in each row. And because we have 6 cards at the moment, we're going to have 2 rows of 3 cards in each. All right, so because we're thinking in terms of columns and rows, that immediately makes me think about using display grid or CSS grid. So if you look at a lot of websites online and you look at the way that they lay out their cards, there's usually either Flexbox being used or grid. And so you can actually achieve this layout with Flexbox, but I think it's a little bit more appropriate to use grid here because we are going for columns and rows. So on this containing element, let's set a display grid like that, and we'll save. And now what we've done is we've put the card container, as well as its child card elements, into this grid formatting context. So now there's going to be special properties that we're going to be able to apply to the containing element as well as to the child grid items. But before we get into some of those properties, let's talk about what just happened, right? We set display grid, and we didn't really see any change here in the viewport. And that's because by default, CSS Grid is just going to take each of our elements and lay them out so that each element occupies the full width of the container. So essentially we have one column. It's like a one column layout. And CSS Grid, it automatically creates rows based on the number of elements within the container. So in order to get more than one column, we have to use a property called grid template columns. And this is going to allow us to explicitly set the amount of columns that we want in our grid and the sizing of those columns. So let's start off by making 3 columns, and we'll make them each 200 pixels. And let's see what happens. Right, so now that we save, we can see we have this outer parent element, and inside of that we have 2 rows, each having 3 columns, and each one of these columns is 200 pixels, as you can see here. So that's fine, but the thing is that we want the 3 columns in each row to fill out the entire width of the containing element. So fortunately, grid template columns gives us a lot of flexibility in terms of what kind of units we can use to specify the widths of the columns. So we don't only have to use pixels, like we can use percentages, for example. So maybe if I did something like 33.33%, and then I did that 3 times, and then I saved. And now you can see that basically these 3 columns in each row fills out the entire width of the container. But CSS Grid gives us a really easy way to do this without using percentages, without actually having to figure out the calculations for each one of the widths. We can use a function called repeat. And the first argument that we're going to pass to repeat is going to be the number of columns that we want. So we want 3 columns. And then separated by a comma, we want to specify the width of each of those columns. All right, so if I put 33.33% here and I save, you can see that there's no difference, right? This is sort of just a shorthand way of doing it. But even better than that, CSS Grid gives us something called a fractional unit, or an FR unit. And that allows us to do away with having to make any exact calculations, any percentage calculations ourselves. Right, so if we know that we want 3 columns and that we want the totality of those columns to take up the entire width of the containing element, no matter what it is, we can set 3 columns each at 1 FR, or 1 fraction of the total width of the containing element. And now if I save, right, you can see that each one of these columns takes up exactly 1/3 of the container's width. And the nice thing about this is that this is completely responsive. So if I expand the browser window, right, you can see each one of these columns is expanding accordingly so that they still each take up 1 fraction or basically 1/3 of the containing width. And the same holds true if I shrink this browser's window, if I narrow it. Right, so this FR unit makes it really easy for us to define these proportions of columns without having to figure out the percentages or the pixels of what we're trying to do. So just to clarify, let's try something else with these FR units. Let's say that we want the second column in each row to be twice as wide as the first and the third column. So with our FR units, all we have to do is we can say 1FR, 2FR, 1FR. And let's save. And here you can see that middle column takes up twice as much width as this and this, the first and third columns. All right, so we're leaving it to CSS Grid to figure out the mathematics of it for us. Or maybe I want to say the second column, let's give that 4 FR units, and then that'll allow us to make the third column 2 FR units. And you can see how CSS Grid apportions each of those columns according to our FR units. But for our purposes, we are going to use that repeat function because typically in a card layout, you'll see these cards having the same widths or equal widths. So we're going to repeat 3 at 1 FR, right? And now we have our equal width columns in 2 rows. Now, what I want to do on the card container is I want to create some margin around it so we can separate it from the outer viewport. So right now it's kind of hard to distinguish it. So let's set that margin to be 32 pixels. And the next thing that we can do is let's create some gap in between each of these rows and columns, because we want to create some separation between the cards. So using CSS Grid on the parent card container, we can use a property called gap. And let's set that to 1 rem, right? So 1 rem in our case is going to equal 16 pixels. That's the root font size. And let's get rid of the border on that card container because we don't need it anymore. And now this is starting to look a little bit more like a card layout. So this gap property, this is a shorthand for column gap and row gap. Right? So if I just wanted to create a gap between the columns, I can use column gap, and I could say 1 rem. All right, now you can see that the rows are collapsed, but we still have the gap in the columns. Or similarly, I can do row gap at 1 rem, right? And you see the result here. But we want gaps between both columns and rows, so we can just do gap. And now before we go any further with our styling, let's go back to our index.html and let's revisit our elements a little bit. Right, so as you can see at the moment, these are all set up as divs, both the outer containing element as well as the individual cards. But let's try to make these tags more semantic. Right, semantic meaning that we want to give them meaning. So a div is sort of an anonymous element. It's an element that's used to group things together, but it doesn't necessarily tell us about the function of the element on the page, like what purpose is it serving. So for the outer containing element, instead of making that a div, let's make that a section element. Because basically this card grid, you can imagine it would be a section on a page. So it might be one section amongst other sections on the page. Now for the child items, since these are going to be cards that link to blog posts, you'll commonly see these as article tags. And an article tag is used when you have some kind of standalone content. They say it's content that can be syndicated. In other words, when you have an article, that's something that you can take out of the context of your current site and you can use on another site. For example, if you think about something like the Associated Press, right, where you have all these different news articles, each one of those articles can be put in different newspapers, the New York Times, CNN, whatever, because each one of those articles is like a standalone thing. It's about a specific topic, it has an author, it has its own heading. All right, so this is a good choice for blog posts and the cards associated with those blog posts. So let's make 6 of those. And if we save, we don't visually see any difference, but now we've given more semantic meaning to our HTML markup. which helps us as developers and screen readers and so forth better make sense of the content that we have. So now let's go back to our CSS and let's apply some other styles to the container. So as of now, you can see if I expand the browser window, right, all of these columns, they're just expanding as much as they want. But we want to kind of put a limit on that. So for this card container, let's give it a max width of, let's say, 1200 pixels. And now, if we try to expand the browser window, you're going to see that after a certain point, the cards are no longer going to expand because the containing element has that max width on it. However, they can shrink if the browser window gets narrower. But the other thing that we want to do, you'll notice that the container is not centered in the browser window. So in order to do that, let's give the containing element a margin left of auto and a margin right of auto. And if we go back and look in the browser, you can see now that the containing element stays centered in the viewport. Because what that margin left and margin right auto does is it takes the remaining space, the space that goes beyond the width of the containing element, and it divides it equally amongst the right and the left side of the screen. And so now we get that nice centered container on the page. Now we want to start thinking about how this grid container is going to work responsively. Right? How does it size for mobile, for tablet, and for desktop layouts? Because if we're on a mobile device, if we shrink the screen down, it's going to be something like this. We don't want to have 3 columns. Typically what you'll see with these card layouts is on a mobile device, you'll just have a 1-column layout. And then as you expand to like a tablet view, you'll get 2 columns. And then finally in the desktop, you'll get what we have, which is that 3-column layout. So in this video, I'm going to show one way to change these columns using media queries. But in a subsequent video, we're going to learn a better way to do this, an automatic way to do this that Grid gives us. But for this video, we're going to do this with media queries, and we're going to be modifying the grid template columns value. Right, so now we have 3 columns repeating. But we're going to start out by actually setting this to 1. Right? So now we have that 1-column layout. And this is going to work for mobile screen sizes. So by setting the base grid template columns value to 1, we're going to take a mobile first approach. Right? So in this rule, we're going to be specifying how many columns do we want to be at the mobile setting. And then we'll use our media queries to specify how many columns we want at the tablet and the desktop views. So let's create a media query for a tablet layout. Let's say at media, and because we're using this mobile first approach, we're going to use min width here. And we're going to say min width, let's say 700 pixels. Right? For that card container, we're going to redefine grid template columns to not be 1 column, but rather 2 columns, each at 1 FR. So now let's check it out what happens if we expand the browser window. So here we have 1 column, and once it gets past 700 pixels in this case, we're getting that 2-column layout. So then let's go ahead and let's set up a media query for what happens at the desktop view. We're going to make another media query, again, giving it min width. Right, so anything greater than the min width value, let's say 1200 pixels. Okay, anything greater than that, the card container, it's going to have a grid template columns value of 3 columns at 1 FR. Okay, so now if I expand the browser window, we go from tablet to desktop view. Right, so that's one approach to using media queries to change the number of grid columns at different layout widths. 1, 2, 3. One final thing I want to do here, just because it's annoying me, is I want to set a width, not just a max width on that card container, but I want to set a width to 90%, just so that even when we narrow the browser window, like when we get down here, we can still see some space around the card container. And it's a little bit nicer like that. So let's move on now and start actually adding some content to our cards. We're going to make these cards into cards for a holiday recipes blog. So each card is going to have an image, it's going to have a category, something like fall or Easter or Halloween. It's going to have a title. It's going to have a short description of the recipe. And then on the bottom of the card, we'll have an avatar of the blog post author, as well as the blog post author's name and the date of the post. Now, the idea when creating cards is that each one is going to link further to a complete page or article that has more information about the particular subject or topic that's being presented. In this case, a holiday recipe. And because we need our cards to link to that content, there are a couple different approaches we can take. The first approach is to wrap all of the card's content with an anchor tag. The second approach is to wrap only certain elements contained within the card in anchor tags, like maybe the title or the image. We're going to go with the first approach here. Later on, we're going to try the second approach as well. But for now, we're going to be wrapping everything in the card, its image and its text content, all in one big anchor link. All right, so let's go ahead and get back into some code now. Let's close our styles.css file to make some room on the screen. And for the time being, we'll just work with one of these article elements. So just one blog post for now. We'll delete all the others. And inside of this article tag, this is where we want to put our anchor tag. And because for this project, we're just working on the design of the cards, we're just going to put a £sign inside of the href attribute. So that way this anchor tag won't actually take us anywhere. Now on this anchor tag, let's create a class for it so we can handle some styling. And we'll give it a class of card-link. And now within the anchor tag, what we want to do is we want to create basically two different sections of the card. So the first section, which is going to be at the top of the card, is going to be our image. Or this could be your rich media section, so it could be a video or something like that. But for us, it's going to be an image. So we'll create an image tag. And then the second part of the card, basically the lower half, is going to be the body of the card that contains basically all of the text content, like the title and the description. And this will make a div, and we'll give this a class of card-body. While we're at it, let's also give this image element a class. And let's call it card-image, or IMG for short. As we're going to be seeing in a moment, we're going to give display of flex to this anchor tag, and that's going to allow us to control the proportions of the image section and the div that contains all the text of the card. We're going to be able to control their proportions against each other. Now let's look a little bit at this anchor tag. Let's open up our styles.css file, and let's put it on the right side of VS Code. Let's make a little bit more room here, and let's also expand our browser window. And notice at the moment that even though we have an anchor tag, which is basically supposedly occupying this entire card, when we hover over it, our cursor doesn't turn into a hand icon, which is usually what happens when you have an anchor tag and you hover over it. So let's inspect this a little bit. If we come into our DevTools in Google Chrome, let's highlight the anchor tag here. And you'll notice here that the display for an anchor tag, it's inline. So this is not a block level element that takes up the full width of the containing element. Right, so in order to make this entire card clickable, what we want to do is we want to target this card link class on the anchor tag, and we need to apply some height to it. So let's come into our CSS, and let's create a rule for that card link class, which is the anchor tag, and let's give it a height of 100%. The other thing that we want to do for this anchor tag is, because it's inline, we want to change it to display flex. And for flex direction, we're going to set that as column. You remember what I said before is that we're wrapping the two main parts of the card, which is the image and the card body div, which contains all the text. We're wrapping that in this anchor tag, And we're going to give it display flex with a flex direction of column because we want these two parts to stack one on top of the other, the image being at the top of the card and the card body text being the lower half of the card. And by setting display flex, we can control their proportions in the card, or their sizing. So once we set that, and then we go back and we hover, now we can see that hand icon, and this tells us, or it tells the user, that this entire card is going to be clickable. And that's actually a very good thing to do, because the more surface area that you have that's clickable, the more obvious it is to the user that this is a clickable item, right? And that it's going to take them to the full blog article. All right, so now let's start actually bringing in our image and also bringing in our text for the card body. So first, let's go ahead and let's bring in an image for this card. And I already have some images here in an images folder that I've downloaded from unsplash.com, and that's a really good resource for getting free images that you can use in your projects. So I'm going to come here into my image tag, and in the source attribute, I'm going to grab an image from that images directory. I know it's in the holiday recipes folder. It's going to be this one right here. And I'll save, and now we can see our image of a nice pumpkin pie for fall. Before we do anything else, let's be good web developers and actually add an alt attribute, or a value for the alt attribute. And we can just say person cutting slice of pumpkin pie. All right, we brought our image in, but one thing you'll notice is that the size of the image is bigger than the size of the card that we had created. And if we take a look at it, if we inspect it, we can see that it has a width of 600 and a height of 397. And the reason for that is if we actually look at the image, which is this one here, and we look down here in VS Code, we can see that the original image size is 600 by 397. So what we want to do is we want to target this card image class like this. And we want to set its width to be 100%. You see, so that way the width of the image is going to be constrained to 100% of the containing element. So that's a good start so far. But the other thing that we can do is we can remove now the height that we added to the card. Remember, before we had set just an arbitrary height of 200 pixels, and that's just because we were experimenting and kind of getting our grid together. But now that we're placing content inside of these cards, the height of the content is going to be what actually determines the height of the card. So let's delete this height of 200 pixels on the card class. All right, and you don't see any difference just yet, and that's because we don't actually have any content inside of our card body. So let's go ahead and do that next. And actually, before we do that, one thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to move this rule for the card underneath these media queries because they really relate to the card container. Right? So if we do that, we can kind of keep them all together like that. So now let's go ahead and let's start adding some content to the card body. For now, we can close our styles.css file. And let's come inside of this div for the card body. And first what we'll do is we'll add an element that's going to be used to display the card's category. So we're going to make that a span. And let's give it a class of card-category. And this first card, this is going to be fall. Since this is a pumpkin pie recipe, that'll be perfect for the fall. Underneath the card category, we're going to create an H2 element. And this is going to be used for the title of the card. So let's give it a class of card-title. And let's give it some text content. For this, we'll say spiced pumpkin pie, a slice of autumn delight. There we go. Next, we're going to have a description for our card. This is going to be a paragraph element. We're going to give it a class of card-description. And here we'll say indulge in the warm flavors fall with our irresistible spiced pumpkin pie recipe. A delicious slice of autumn delight. And then finally in our card, we're going to have a little sort of subsection. And this subsection is going to contain the avatar or image of the author, as well as the author's name and the date that the post was published. So for this, let's create a div. And let's give it a class of card-post-info. Now basically in the same way that we created two main sections inside of the anchor tag, right, the image and then the text content, we're going to sort of do the same thing here within this card-post-info class div. And we'll be using Flexbox on this section as well. So as you'll see, right, you can use little dashes and spots of Flexbox within other elements, other containing elements. You can use it inside of the card container, which has display grid. So you don't have to just exclusively use one or the other. It's not just a matter of using grid or Flexbox, but you kind of use them together in the different places that you need them. Okay, so inside of here, let's start out with an image element, which is going to be the image for the avatar. Okay, and I have some avatars that I've already saved inside of my images directory. And again, I've gotten these from unsplash.com. So there's my first one. And let's fill in the alt attribute here. Let's say author Keith Williams. And let's give this a class of card-avatar. Right, and then the next part of this card post info div is going to be the text content. So for this, we're going to have the author and we're going to have the date of the post. And we want to wrap these inside of a div because they're kind of going to be like in their own separate section. So let's create the first div here, which is going to be the author, and we'll say Keith Williams. And for this, let's give it a class of card-author. Okay, and then underneath this for the date, there is a semantic element we can use, which is called the time element. And even though it's called time, it can also be used for dates as well. So we'll put November 2nd, 2023 for this one. And we'll give it a class of card-date. All right, so even though the styling doesn't look right at the moment, we're going to address that in a second, but basically we have our HTML elements and we have our text content for this card. You can see here that this text, right, by default, it looks blue and it's got these underlines. And remember, that's because this whole thing is wrapped in an anchor tag. So these are just the default stylings that the browser gives us for anchor tags. But we want to get rid of that. We're going to apply our own styling. So let's go ahead and let's open our styles.css file. All right, and this anchor tag, remember, has a class of card link. So on here, let's set text decoration to none. And that's going to get rid of that underline. The other thing that we can do is let's set all of the text to a black color. And you can see it's starting to look a little bit better already. Also, I want to change the font. So let's make a rule for the body element. In here, let's use a property called font family. And let's set this to Arial. So this is going to set it basically to a sans serif font. And you can see that change there. All right, now one thing I noticed that's kind of funny is I spelled pie incorrectly. I said spiced pumpkin pike, which would be probably a pretty disgusting fish. So let's just change that to pie in our HTML. There we go, that's better. All right, now let's do some styling on some of these elements within the card body. Let's go ahead and style up this card category. And let's reduce the width of the browser screen for a second so we can get some more space for our code. All right, and here we can see on that span for the card category, we have a class of card categories, so let's target that. At the bottom of our styles.css file, let's make a rule for card-category. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use text transform to set the card category to uppercase. And you can see that change here. And of course, we could have gone here in the HTML and we could have just spelled fall all in uppercase like this. However, we can use text transform in our CSS to have one single place where we can change our text to uppercase or lowercase or whatever we want. And this just makes it very convenient to do so without actually having to go into the HTML and changing every single card category text. Now I want to give this card category text a color, and I have a hex code for this, which is a reddish sort of color, BC2E14. I'm going to increase the font weight to 600, and you can see it makes it a little thicker, a little bolder. All right, so that should do for now for the card category. If you're looking at this card, you might be getting a little angry at the fact that everything is so crunched together. So let's create a little bit of breathing room, a little bit of white space in this card. Let's target this entire card body element, and we'll create a rule for it, card-body. And let's give it some padding. Let's say 32 pixels and see how that looks. And once we save, we start feeling a lot better about ourselves right away. Right? We have some more breathing room, some more space. What I'm going to do though, instead of using pixels as the unit for the padding, I'm going to convert this into rem. So since the browser's base font is 16 pixels, that's pretty much standard. I'm going to say 2 rem, right? So 2 times 16, and that should equal 32 pixels. So once we save, we won't see a difference. But the benefit of doing it like this with rems is that since the user has the ability, if they want, to go into their browser's settings, right, they can adjust that base font size if they want to make it larger or smaller. And so if we start using these relative units, like rems and ems, everything is going to scale up proportionally to the font size, to the base font size. So that means that all of the sizings and the spacings that we set in our design, right, they're still going to hold in proportion regardless of the base font size. Right, so they'll all scale down or scale up together. The next thing that I want to do is start getting this card post info section in shape. At the moment, the avatar and the text content is stacking on top of each other. But I want to make this so that the avatar is on the left and the text content is on the right of it. So let's take a look in our HTML. Right here is that div for the card post info. And it contains these two elements, which are enclosed in a div. So that means if we target the card post info parent div and we apply a display of flex to it, right, this image and the text, they're going to lay out horizontally. So let's do that. Let's create a rule in our CSS for card-post-info, and let's just go ahead and set it to display flex. All right, and there you can see we went from a column kind of thing to a row. But there's still some work to be done here. First of all, I want the author and the date to be more centered. I want it to be kind of aligned here in the middle of the image. And for that, we can use the align items property. Let's set it to center. So that's one of the nice things about Flexbox is how quickly you can do these things. The default for align items is start or flex start, and that's why this text initially was appearing at the top of the image. But by setting align item center, we can quickly center the text against the image. Now, I also think that the image and the text, they're a little bit too crunched together, so I want to create some space. Well, Flexbox, as well as Grid, gives us a special property called gap, and that allows us to kind of set a gap or a gutter in between different elements. So let's go ahead and let's set gap. And I'm going to set this to 0.75 rems, which is going to equal 12 pixels. And the idea is that I want to create some separation between the avatar image and the text, but I still want them to be pretty close together because they should feel like a unit. Our card avatar is a square at the moment, but I want to turn this into a circle. That's something you'll commonly see in a card. So to get access to this image element, we have a class that we created, and we called it card-avatar. So let's create a rule for that, card-avatar. And what we want to do is we want to first set its width and its height. So let's set its width to be 3.75 rem, which is 60 pixels. And I'm also going to set the height to be exactly the same, 3.75 rem as well. Now, since I set the width and the height to be the same to create this perfect square, I can use a border radius property. And if I apply 50% to it, you're going to see it turns it into a perfect circle. The only weird thing, though, which you might notice, is that even though the element itself is a perfect circle, the image inside of it, it does look kind of stretched. And to fix that, we're going to use a property called object fit. And we're going to set that to a value of cover. and take a look at the image, take a look at the difference. See, this is with object fit cover, and if I comment it out and save, you can see the image kind of becomes a little bit distorted. So what object fit cover does is it retains the aspect ratio of the image so it doesn't get distorted. It sometimes might crop the image as well if it needs to, but in this case the cropping is very minimal. So I think it works pretty well. And we can actually use this object fit cover for the image at the top of the card as well. And this will just ensure that the image fills up the entire space without changing its aspect ratio. Before we continue working on the styles for our card's body text, let's go ahead and let's actually add in another card, because we want to start seeing how cards with different content, like different images and different text, work together. So for now, let's go ahead and let's close our styles.css file. And let's grab one of these article elements in our HTML and select the whole thing. And then we'll come down and we'll copy and paste it. Right? For now, they both have the same content, but we're going to replace that. For the top image for the second card, let's grab another image from our folder. We'll get this one here. Okay, the category for this one is going to be Easter. The card title is going to be Chocolate Cupcakes with Candy Egg Surprises. And then for the card description, we'll do treat your taste buds to delightful chocolate cupcakes adorned with hidden candy egg surprises. Perfect for a fun and festive Easter. And then we'll get a different avatar. And this one's going to have a different author name and a different date. Let's jump back into our styles.css file now. And before we go any further, let's go back to this card container. Remember, which is the total parent grid for all these cards. And just as we did before, instead of setting things in pixels, for the margin, instead of doing 32 pixels, we'll do 2 rem. And let's also increase the gap between the cards. So again, the gap is setting the size of the gutters between the cards. And right now we're doing 1 rem, so let's bump that up to 2 rem to create some more space. Okay, now we have a little bit more breathing room between the cards. So at the moment, with these two cards, even though the text and the body, it's still a kind of all jumbled together, right? We're going to fix that. But basically, what I wanted to see is if the items in the cards were aligned. Right, so at the moment, we can see the categories are aligned, the title, the description, the avatar, and the author info. Right, it's basically, they're all aligned horizontally. And this is at the media query that we created for the tablet view, right, where we have 2 cards in a row. But let's see what happens if we expand the browser window and we go to that media query for the desktop view. We'll now take a look at what's happening in the cards. Right? Some parts of them are aligned, like the title and the category. But take a look here at the avatar and the author info. Right? This one is higher than this one. And that's creating kind of a messy look. The reason that's happening is because the descriptive text inside of this card has an extra line than the descriptive text in this card, and so it's pushing down the div that's following it. But we can use Flexbox here to help us out with this. So let's make some Flexbox settings now to help us with this issue. Let me narrow VS Code a little bit so we can see the browser window. And let's first look at this card body area. All right, let's go down and find the card body class. Right here, here's the rule for card body. And let's use that image shortcut that I showed you earlier to create a quick border around this element. All right, so what we can see here so far in these cards is that this card, right, it takes up the entire height of the card. And remember, this one is the one that had more text content in the description. But this one that has less text content, it's not taking up the entire height. You can see here that the border shows that it's stopping short of the entire height. So the first change that we can make is on the card body, we can use a property called FlexGrow. Now by default, this FlexGrow property, it's 0. And when you have FlexGrow of 0, that means that the item, the flex item, is not going to grow at all. But if we set it to a value of 1, well, check out what happens. I'm going to save, and now you can see that this body text, or the bottom part of the card, expands to fill up the entire remainder of the height. Right, so that's why initially we set up display flex on the card, on the anchor tag, which was enclosing the whole card. Remember here, we did display flex and flex direction column. Because like I said, that's going to, or that allows us to change the proportions of the two sections, the image and the body text. Right, we left the image text where it was, but we said, leave this image where it is, but if there is extra space in the card, in terms of the height, fill it out with this body text section. All right, so that's the first step that we can make, but you can see it still didn't solve the problem of what we were talking about earlier, which was the alignment of these avatar sections. So fortunately, we can use that same FlexGrow trick here. In order to do that, what we're going to do is on the card body element, we're going to turn that into a flex container as well and set it to flex direction column. And then for this description text, we're going to set that to be FlexGrow of 1. And what that's going to do is it's going to allow this descriptive text to expand and thereby pushing down the avatar div section. So let's go ahead and do that. All right, so on the card body, we're going to say display flex and flex direction column. And then we need to target this paragraph to give it that FlexGrow of 1. So let's go back to our index.html. And we can see that the paragraphs have a class of card-description. All right, so let's target that card-description. And now let's give it a FlexGrow of 1. And let's save and check it out. You can see that the avatars, author name, and date are all aligned, even though this description section has less text than this one. And in my opinion, so far, this creates a nicer symmetry than what we saw previously. Let's go back to our index.html and let's add in that third card, because remember we said we want to create a row of 3 cards. So again, we're going to take one of these article elements, copy and paste it. I'm going to come down here in my index.html. Okay, paste it down here, and there's our third card. And for this one, let's pull in the image for the third one. Okay, this one is going to be for Valentine's Day. And the title of this one is going to be Heart-Shaped Sugar Cookies for Valentine's Day. Let's remember to do the alt text for this one, for the image. So this one we can say heart-shaped Valentine's Day cookies. So the alt text is important for screen readers and accessibility purposes. So it's a good idea to put that in. Let's continue here with the description. We'll do celebrate love with our delectable heart-shaped sugar cookies. A sweet and thoughtful treat for Valentine's Day that will melt hearts. Aww. All right, let's get our third avatar. And this alt text will be author Emily Sullivan. Okay, we want to change the card author name to Emily Sullivan. And we'll make this date March 6th, 2023. Nice. All right, let's take a look here and see how we're doing at the moment with our responsiveness. So right now we're at desktop view, 3 cards in a row. Let's narrow the window. And here we go down to 2 cards in a row. Of course, because we only have 3, we only have 1 card in the second row, but that's fine. And then let's go down to the mobile view, where we get 1 card per row. Basically 1 column of cards. All right, so it's starting to come together. Of course, we still have some spacing issues to deal with in the card body. So let's deal with that right now. Let's go back into our styles.css file. And what we'll do with these elements in the card body is we're going to apply some margins to them to create some more spacing between them, right? Because right now they're all just a big mess. Everything's kind of together. So for the card category, right here, Fall, Easter, and Valentine's Day, let's create a little bit of separation between it and the title. Let's go to the card category rule here in our CSS, and let's set a margin bottom. Let's set that to 0.5 rem, right? And that's going to be 8 pixels. All right, so now we've created a little bit more space. It's starting to breathe and open up a little bit more now. The title and the description, right, those are too close together. So let's go and find the rule for the card title. I'm not sure if we created that yet. No, I guess we haven't. Okay, so let's go under card category, and that class is card-title. And for this one, let's set a margin bottom of 1.5 rem. All right, and that opens it up even more now. And the reason that I created more of a margin between the title and the descriptive text is because I want to make the category and the title feel more like a unit together. It's almost like the category and the title form more of the heading of the card body, and then the descriptive section is a paragraph section that's kind of set off all by itself. But then under the descriptions, you can see that we can use some space there as well, because the avatars, those are too close. So let's go into the card description rule, and let's give it a margin bottom of maybe 2 rem. There we go. Okay, and so far I think these cards are looking a lot nicer than they were a moment ago, because for the reader there's more of a clear separation between these different parts. I think also with the descriptive text, maybe we can open up the line height a little bit to create a little bit more of a space between each line. So let's try line height of 1.25 and save. And now you can see there's a little bit more space in between the lines. Maybe that makes it a little bit more readable and opens it up a little bit more. The other thing I want to do is in this date, I want to soften the color of that so we create more of a contrast with the author's name and the date. So if we look on our HTML, we can see that for the time element, which is used for that date, we have a class of card date. So let's target that. So let's do card-date. And for this, I'm going to set more of a grayish color. And I have this hex code, -777. All right, and you can see that creates a little bit more of a contrast between the author's name and the date, which creates a little bit of a visual hierarchy there. And I think we can get rid of this border that we put in on the card body here on line 51, because we don't need that anymore, so let's just get rid of that. And right now you can see our cards are looking pretty good. Right, we still have that symmetry that we created with the avatars at the bottom. In a couple of these cards, you can see that the titles here have 3 lines, whereas the first one only has 2. And so this does kind of push down the starting point of the description section a little bit. And you could probably tweak that more if you want. Maybe you can reduce the size of this, the font size of this title a little bit, might align that better. But we can see that if we change the browser size anyway, those things are going to line up differently at different sizings. And now they look more aligned because at this breakpoint we only have 2 cards per row, and so the title has a little bit more room and it can fit on 2 lines, and so everything lines up nicely. All right, so that's something that you can possibly further tweak if you want, or you can leave it the way it is. I think the main thing is that all the cards that are in the row have the same height, and that basically the symmetry of the text is pretty much lined up. There are a couple more things that we're going to do to these cards to make them even nicer. One of the things is, rather than creating this explicit kind of border here, we're going to create a nice box shadow effect for all the cards. We're also going to create a hover effect, where when we hover over a card with our cursor, it's going to create this transition in the box shadow, which is going to give it the illusion of lifting up a little bit off of the page. So let's start off with that box shadow. Okay, so for the box shadow, what we want to do is we want to target the card itself. At the moment, we have this border set on the card, and we were really just using that just to see the outline of the card. But we're going to get rid of that. Let's comment it out for the time being. And instead of setting a border on the card, we're just going to be setting a box shadow. And just through setting a box shadow alone, that is going to create the border for the card. So let's do box shadow. And this is how we're going to set it. We're going to do 0px, 2px, 4px. And I'm going to explain all this in a second. For the color for the box shadow, we're going to use HSL, which is hue, saturation, and lightness. And we're going to do 0 degrees, 0%, 0%, and then slash 0.6. And let's just save and see what happens. And there we go. We can see that box shadow on each of the cards. And notice we didn't actually have to set any explicit border. That box shadow is basically creating the border for us on the cards. Now, how does this box shadow work? Well, these first two values, 0px and 2px, this is setting the horizontal and the vertical offset of the box shadow. So you can see there's no horizontal offset, but there is a little bit of vertical offset, this 2px. Right? And that's why we see the little bit of box shadow descending here from the card. Just to show, like, let's say that we did set some horizontal offset. Let's say we did 10px. See, now you can see the box shadow poking out of the card on the right side. But we're going to get rid of that. This 4px value here, what that does is set the blur of the box shadow. And just like in real life, when you have an object, like let's say that you put your hand up against a wall or close to a wall, as you move your hand further away from that wall, the blur of the shadow that's cast is going to increase. It's going to become more blurry, basically. Like for example, let's say instead of 4, we did something a lot more drastic. Let's say we did 10px. You see when I did that and save, the cards, they look like they lifted up a little bit off the page. Or off the screen, I should say. Let's go back to 4px and we'll see the difference. Okay? And in a second, we're going to be creating a hover effect, and that's going to increase the blur of that box shadow, as well as a couple of the other properties. So for this hue, saturation, and lightness, what we've done, as you can see, is we've set everything basically to 0, right? 0 degrees, 0%, 0%. This 0.6 after the slash, it represents the alpha value, or the transparency. Right, so basically how opaque or transparent is the black. Like, let's say that instead of 0.6, we bump that up to 0.9. Now you can see that the box shadow has darkened. To contrast, if we set it to something lower, like 0.2, you can see it's become much lighter now. So let's set it back to that 0.6. And this is going to be our basic box shadow for the cards. Now let's set up that hover effect for the box shadow. What's cool is that now something new in CSS is that we can do nesting basically natively. Right? We don't have to use something like Sass. So if we wanted to create a pseudo class for the card, we can do it like this. We can use an ampersand colon, and then we can put the pseudo class that we want. In this case, we're going to do hover. And in here is where we're going to adjust or alter that box shadow. Right, so a pseudo class, if you don't know, it's basically like a different state that occurs on the card. So this is going to be for the hover state. We're saying what happens when the cursor goes over the card. Well, in order to see something happening, we need to adjust this box shadow. So as a starting point, let's copy and paste it into the hover pseudo class. And then let's make some adjustments here to the box shadow. One of the things that we're going to do, like we said before, is we're going to increase the blur. So instead of 4 pixels, let's really bump it up. Let's do 30 pixels, and let's just take a look at that. Let's see what happens when we hover over a card. Okay, it's pretty abrupt at the moment, but it does kind of look like the card pops up. The other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to increase those horizontal and vertical offsets. And that's another thing that happens naturally when you have a shadow. In the example I gave before, where I said I was putting my hand up against a wall, casting a shadow, but then moving my hand back from the wall, well, if you actually try this, you'll see that the shadow, it kind of moves, like the offset of the shadow, depending on the light source, is going to go down, or it's going to go either to the right and down, or maybe to the left and down. So in this case, let's just try increasing the horizontal offset to... Let's try 3 pixels. Oops. And let's try changing the vertical offset as well to 6 pixels. And let's just see how that looks. All right, so that's increasing the realism of the lifting effect just a little bit more. And then the other thing that we can do to enhance this effect is we can reduce that alpha channel opacity. So instead of 0.6 on the hover, let's make this 0.3. So basically the darkness of the box shadow, it's going to lighten. And there you can see the result. Now, like we said, this is happening pretty abruptly. So we want to slow this down a little bit. We want to create more of a nice transition from the normal basic state to the hover state. And we can do that by using the transition property. And as you can see, we set this on the basic state, which is the card. So we're going to be transitioning another property as well in a second. So I'm going to say transition all, right? So this means that anything that's changing once that hover state occurs is going to have this transition applied to it. Just for now, to see the result of the transition, let's set this kind of long. Let's set it to 2 seconds duration. And let's see how it looks. All right, so you can see that the hover effect is now kind of slowly growing. The card is lifting in a more gradual way. It's not so abrupt. Let's speed it up a little bit more for now to 1 second and check that out. And the other thing we're going to add to this transition to make it a little bit more realistic is we're going to add an easing to it. We're going to use something called ease out. And let's see how that looks. So what does this ease out do? Well, basically, if we didn't have ease out, the transition is going to happen in more of a linear way, right? That means that the difference or the change from this box shadow settings to these box shadow settings is going to happen sort of in a straight line, speaking in terms of time. If we set an ease out, though, that means that the transition, it's going to start right away, right on the hover. However, it's going to slow down just a little bit as it gets to its final state. And this is more of the way that things move in real life. They don't move in this mathematically rigid linear way. Right? Things kind of ease in or ease out or ease in and ease out. So I could have used ease in here, right? I could do that. And then if I hover, right, you notice that it's a little bit different. Because right now, it takes a little bit longer to fade into the effect, basically. The start of it is a little bit more gradual. But I think here, ease out will be a better choice because we want the hover effect to feel more immediate to the user. Right? So that right away when they hover, that animation starts happening. And at the moment, the transition is a bit long. We can really shorten that up. Let's make it 0.2 seconds, which is going to be 200 milliseconds. And that's going to be really quick. And so, of course, now the ease out is going to be very subtle, but it's still nice to have in there just to add a little bit more of a feel of realism. Now, one other thing that we can do on hover is we can have the card just shift up just slightly in position. And this is going to make it feel like it lifts just a little bit more. Like, notice what happens if I hover over the card now. You see the bottom of the card, it's a little bit more noticeable where the box shadow is. A little bit more noticeable than the top part of the card, the image. So let's say on the hover, we want to do a transform. And that transform is going to be translate Y. Right, so this is going to move the card on the y-axis or vertically. And we want the card to move up just a little bit. So let's set this to -4 pixels. And then let's see how that looks. So you see when I hover over the card, not only does the box shadow change, but the card actually moves up just slightly and enhances the effect. And it makes the image on the top portion of the card look like it's being lifted along with the body as well, in a more obvious way than it was previously. Now, the thing that's nice about having these hover effects and the box shadow on the cards is that these things are signifiers of clickability for the user. Right, so when a user comes to your page and they do this kind of thing, they should have an idea that, oh, this stuff can be interacted with. This is something I can click on. Now, one final thing we're going to do for these cards is give them a border radius that's going to round their corners. And this is going to help them look more like real cards, like real-world cards. So again, coming into this rule for the card class, let's this time create a border radius. And let's set it to 6 pixels. And what you can see is that the bottom corners of the cards are more rounded now. But notice that the tops of the cards are still pointed, are still kind of squarey. So in order to fix that, we actually need to apply this border radius to the card image class as well. So let's try that. In the rule for the card image, let's also set border radius to that 6 pixels and see what happens. And now you can see that the tops of the cards are rounded as well as the bottom of the cards. But notice that the bottom of the image on the top of the cards is rounded. You see here? So that doesn't look great. What we can do to fix that is instead of targeting the border radius for the entire image, let's just target the top left and the top right corners. So instead of just doing border radius 6 pixels, let's do border top left radius 6 pixels. And then let's do border top right radius 6 pixels and save. All right, so now you can see the top right and left borders of the image are rounded, but the bottom right and left are not. Isn't that a nice thing that we can just target those individually? Right, so now these cards are looking more polished. Now let's say that we decided that we wanted to actually change the border radius. Like instead of 6 pixels, we wanted to do something much more drastic. So if I came into the rule for the card and I did, let's say 16 pixels instead of 6, well, now you can see the bottom left and right are much more rounded, but unfortunately, the top left and right stayed at 6 pixels. I mean, we could go and change that. We could go here and do 16 and 16, but it would be a lot more convenient if we could do that all in one place, and we can. So let's set the border radius for the card back to 6 pixels, and what we're going to do is we're going to use something called CSS variables or CSS custom properties. Now, it's common to place these in the root element, which is equivalent to the HTML element. And it's a selector that we can use to set up these custom properties or CSS variables so that they're made available globally to the entire CSS file so that they can be used in any of the rules in the CSS file. So in order to create a CSS variable, we have to use this special syntax, right? We're going to first create a name for our variable. So we have to use 2 dashes, and then we create whatever name we want. Let's call it card border radius. And let's set it to 6 pixels, just like we had before. Okay. Now the thing is, we have to actually use this in one of the rules, or in multiple rules, which is really what we want to do. And so the first place that we want to use it is in this card rule. Instead of just saying 6 pixels, we want to substitute that CSS variable there. And the way that we can do it is with using this var function. Right, so we do var in a pair of parentheses, and then all we have to do is put the name of our CSS variable in there, which we called card border radius. So let's go down and let's find the 2 other spots where we're setting that border radius, right here in this card image rule. And again, in place of the 6 pixels, let's substitute our CSS variable. So card border radius, and then we'll do it for this one, var card border radius. Okay, so now I saved, and you can see we have the same result as before. However, the nice thing is that if we do want to change this, we can just do it here in one spot. So let's do something extreme. Instead of 6 pixels, let's say 20 pixels. And then check it out. We have much more rounded cards now. And you can see it applying to all corners, top left and right, and bottom left and right. Awesome. And let's see how our cards are looking at different screen sizes, right? So here's like the full desktop view. Let's shrink it down to more of a tablet view. And let's go even further, shrink it down to a mobile view. And there we go. All right, we're going to move forward now and try a different approach to creating our cards. If you remember earlier on, I said there were a couple approaches to creating cards. One of them was using an anchor tag to wrap all the elements of the card. And that's what we've been doing here so far. But now we're going to take a different approach, and instead of wrapping everything with the anchor tag, we're going to just pinpoint certain elements that we want to wrap with anchor tags. So those are just going to be individual elements within the card. We're also going to be seeing another cool way to set up our grid, which is going to allow us to eliminate the need to write media queries. But before we do anything, let's clean up a couple things. First, in our CSS, instead of this 20 pixel card border radius, let's go back and let's do just 6 pixels, so it's not so round. And then also notice here in the card container rule that we have a couple different lines where we're declaring our margins. Here on line 14, we're saying margin to rem. But then also on line 17 and 18, we're doing margin left and margin right. So the effect of this is that the top and bottom margins are getting the to rem, but the margin left and margin right are setting the left and right sides of the container to auto. So rather than doing those 3 separate declarations, let's consolidate them all into one single declaration by using the margin shorthand. So let's comment out this line, and let's comment out these 2 lines. And now here, let's just say margin, and we're still going to have the top and bottom be to rem. But then instead of making those separate margin left and margin right declarations, we can just do auto here, and we're going to achieve the same result, you see. And it's still centered in the page, and it's still got this margin here. So the way that this margin shorthand is working is that the first value, the to rem, is going to apply to the top and the bottom of the container, and then the auto is going to apply to the left and right sides. So it's a way that we can make our CSS more terse and save some room in our code. The other thing that I want to do is get rid of this hover effect now on the cards. Because like I said, we're just going to be wrapping individual elements in anchor tags and not the whole card. So let's come down to our card rule, and let's just eliminate this hover pseudo class. And now we can see it's gone. Let's jump back now into our index.html file, and let's restructure our cards a little bit. The first thing that I want to do is I want to comment out the second 2 cards so that we can just focus on the first card. At the moment, you can see the anchor tag here wrapping all of the elements of the card. So since we don't want to do that, let's get rid of the closing anchor tag on line 25, right here. And instead, we're first going to wrap the image element here in the anchor tag. So that means we need to put the closing anchor tag at the end of this image element. And we're going to leave this class of card link on all of our anchor tags. But as you can see, we're going to have to modify it a bit in our CSS, but we're going to do that in a little bit. So for our example, I'm not going to wrap everything in an anchor tag. I'm just going to wrap certain elements. So I'm going to wrap the H2 element, which is the title of the card. And so here we can come inside of our H2 tag and create an anchor tag. The href is just going to be the pound sign. And then the class is going to be that card link class. Again, we have to remember to put the closing anchor tag after the text. One thing you might notice is that here we have an anchor tag wrapping an image element, but here we have an anchor tag enclosed inside of an element, enclosed inside of this H2. When it comes to elements like this, like H2 tags or divs or paragraph tags and so on, you have the option to either enclose them with an anchor tag or put the anchor tag inside of them. And it really comes down to which part of the element you want to be clickable. So if I just wanted the text content itself to be clickable, this would be a good choice. In this case, where I have the image tag inside of the anchor tag, well, this is pretty much the required way to do it, and that's because an image tag, as you can see here, it's a self-closing tag. So it's not possible to wrap the anchor tag with the image element. Another thing that we're going to do is we're going to be getting rid of this entire card post info div. And that's what's containing this avatar image and the name and the date. Because instead of that, we're going to just make the bottom of the card a little call to action section. So let's get rid of this. And instead, let's create a div. We'll give it a class of read more container. And within this div, we're just going to have an anchor tag. The href, again, is going to be the pound. In this one, we're going to give it a class of read more link. And we'll give it some text content, which is going to say read more. And we'll be working on the styling of this in just a little bit. But before we do that, let's get rid of some of the styles that are causing this body content to be pushed off of the card. So let's jump back into our styles.css file. And because we're no longer wrapping all of the content with that anchor tag, which has the class of card link, we're going to comment out everything that has to do with the height or the display of flex. So height, display, flex direction, comment these out. Actually, we'll just delete them. And now if we jump back into our index.html file, you can see it's the article with the class of card, which is now wrapping both the image at the top, which is enclosed in this anchor tag, and this div, which contains the card body on the bottom. So it's this article with the class of card now that we want to give the display of flex and flex direction column to. So here in the rule for the card, let's do that. Let's say display flex, and then flex direction column. And even though you don't see any visual change at the moment by doing that, that's going to help us out later with our flex grow on the card description text. As you can see at the moment, this read more, which is an anchor tag, is appearing with the default browser anchor stylings, the blue and the underline. Since we've already created a class which eliminates those, this class here, card link, let's apply that to this element because we're going to style this more to look like a button. So here in this anchor tag, here on line 23, let's add that class of card-link. Right? And now that does away with that styling. The reason that we're taking this approach here of creating several anchor tags around different individual elements is that we might want to have some of the other elements of the card navigate to other places. For example, now we have the flexibility to link perhaps this category to its own category page, while at the same time we can retain the link to the actual article with either a click on the image or maybe a click on the title or the read more button. Let's move on now and start styling up our read more anchor tag. And like I said previously, we're going to style this to look like a button. Now notice that we're not actually using a button element, but we're using an anchor tag. And sometimes you might see something that visually looks like a button. However, really, the element is an anchor tag. And that's because an anchor tag, in this case, is semantically and accessibility-wise a more appropriate element to use. And that's basically because this is being used to navigate to another page. You know, at the moment, we're just using a pound sign to stay on the page, but in a real-world scenario, this would navigate to a different URL so we could actually read the full article. A button would be a more appropriate choice if we were actually triggering some kind of on-page action. Like maybe if we were developing a game and we wanted a button to start the game. But here, since we're sticking with the anchor tag, we have some work to do to style this into a button. So let's go ahead and do that now. All right, let's go back into our style.css file, and we'll kind of split the screen. Maybe we can see both the index.html on the left, just as a reference, and the CSS file on the right. All right, so what we need to target is this read more link class. Let's come down to the bottom of our style.css file, and let's create a rule for that, read more. It's called read more link, actually, read more -link. And the first obvious thing we can do to start styling this as a button is just create a border. So let's use that BD shortcut, tab. All right, and there we got a little bit of a start. But we can make this look more like a button by using some padding. So we'll do padding. Top and bottom will be 8 pixels, let's say. And then on the right and left side, let's do 48 pixels. And why don't we convert this into rem? So that'll be 3 rem, and this will be 0.5 rem. Okay. Continuing on with the button, let's bump up the font size just a little bit. So let's give it 1.125 rem, just to make it stick out a little bit more. And let's also round the corners of this button. So let's give it a border radius. And here I'll just stick with pixels. I'll give it 24 pixels. All right, now let's address the color of this button. I want to give the color of this button, or make the text basically the same color as this color of the category. So it's this reddish kind of color. Let's go find where that is in our CSS. So that's here in card category. So let's copy this and then come down into our read more link rule and let's paste that in. And you see the read more text change color here. Now I know that I also want to use this reddish color for the border of the button, and then I also want to change it on the hover state so that when I hover over the button, I want the text color to become white. And I want the background color of the button to become red. So at the moment, that would entail putting this hex code in 3 different locations, basically, 3 different declarations. And also remember, we're using that same hex code here in the card category. So if you're thinking the same thing that I am, this would probably be a good candidate for a CSS variable. So first of all, let's copy this hex code, just so we have it. And then let's scroll up to our root selector, and this is the location where we're putting all of our CSS variables. And let's create one for this hex code. We can call it anything we want, of course. Maybe we'll do accent red, and then let's paste the hex code. All right, and so now let's go back to the other rules where we're using this hex code, and instead let's put in accent red. And remember, the reason for doing this, or the benefit of doing it, is that later on, if we decide that we want to change the color, we can just do it here in this one central location instead of having to do it in multiple places. So let's go and find the first one, which is in card category. And instead of using this hex code, we're going to use that var function, and we're going to pass in the name of the CSS variable, which here is accent red. And then we'll continue scrolling down. And in the read more link, which is basically our button, we'll put the CSS variable in there as well for accent color, or accent red. And on the border of this button, instead of using the black, which we have now, let's also use that CSS variable here, accent red. And while we're at it, we might as well put in the hover state. So let's go ahead and do that within the read more link rule. So we can use the ampersand :hover, and we'll say background color now on hover is going to use that CSS variable, accent red. And the color, or the color of the font itself, is going to become white, which is FFF. All right, so let's try that on hover. And that's a very common hover technique for something like a button like this, in which the background and the foreground colors swap. You might notice that on hover, the change is pretty quick and abrupt. So let's try putting a transition on the read more link so we can have a little bit more of a gradual transition. We'll do transition. And here we're going to transition both the color and the background color. So we can do all. And I usually like to start just to test it with something a little bit longer. So let's say 1 second, and let's give it that ease out. Remember that ease out is going to start the transition immediately and then get to the end of its transition state in a little bit more of a gradual way. We'll save and we'll try the hover now. And it's pretty obvious to see the transition. But of course, we're not going to have it that slow. That's way too laggy. So we're going to do something very subtle and much quicker. We'll give it 150 milliseconds. So it still feels pretty responsive for the user, but it has a little bit more finesse compared to what we had initially. So in a minute, we're going to look at that grid template columns property, and we're going to, like I said, see a different way of using it that's going to allow us to eliminate media queries. But before we do that, I want to add in those other two cards. So I'm going to use the article element that we've worked on already with this new structure that we've created. And I'm going to create two more of these and just substitute in the various images and text content that we need. So I'm not going to make you sit through this. I'm going to go ahead and do it, and I'll be right back. All right, so here you can see I've filled in all the new content for the other two cards, and hopefully you've had a chance to do the same. So just to take a look at my index.html file, here's what I have. And one thing that I want to do before we address that grid template columns thing is I want to create sort of a dividing line between this bottom call to action section and all of the text above it with the category, title, and description. So to do that, let's come back into our styles.css file. And for this, we're going to target the read more container class. So let's expand our code a little bit. And let's see where that is. Here you can see the read more container class is on the div that surrounds the read more link. So in our CSS, let's scroll down to the bottom, and right above read more link, let's create a rule for read more container. And now in this case, one simple way that we can create sort of a dividing line here is we can actually just create a border top on this containing element. So instead of doing border like that, like we normally would, we can get a little bit more specific, and we can say border top. And we'll give it 1 pixel so that it's real thin. We'll make it solid. And instead of making it black, we'll make it more of a lighter gray, so it's not too evident. And if you look closely, you can see that line here. Actually, let's make it a little bit darker just for now, just so we can work with it. So let's make this black like that. And of course, it's not really spaced out correctly, so let's work on that next. Since this read more container is the div that contains this button, if we give some padding on the top of this container, we can create some more space between the line and the button. So let's target padding top, and let's give it 1.5 rem, and that looks a lot better. And then let's create a little bit more space between the line and the content above it. So in order to do that, we can use margin. And we can say margin top, and we'll give it 0.25 rem. And that made a little bit of a change, gave a little bit more space here. Now that we have the spacing in place, let's go back and set the color of this border to that lighter gray, for which we used DDD. And this is how it looks if we expand the screen. So you can play around with that, of course, but this kind of helps divide the two sections of the content on top and the call to action button on bottom. All right, so now let's get to the exciting part where we can alter the grid template columns value in a way that's going to help us eliminate the need for media queries. All right, so let's create some space here. And let's go into our styles.css file. And let's find that grid templates column property. That is here on the cart container on line 19. So let me just show you what we're going to use, and then we'll break it down and talk about how it works. Let's comment out this grid template columns declaration, and let's create a new one. And we're still going to use a repeat function, but for the first value, we're going to use something called autofill, and that's auto-fill. Now the second value is going to be something called min-max. And this is basically a function that's going to take two values. First, it's going to be the minimum value. So let's put 300 pixels, and the maximum value, which we're going to use 1FR. And let's save. And before we check out if this works responsively, let's comment out the media queries. So we'll comment out both of these. And now let's try resizing the browser window. So here we have our desktop view with the 3 cards in a row. Let's go down to tablet view right here, 2 cards in a row. And again, we just have one down here because we only have 3 card elements. And then the mobile view, which is that one column. All right, so now you can see we're doing that without any media queries whatsoever. But let's break down how this works and talk about autofill and min-max. The first thing we'll focus on is autofill. Now, you notice in the line that we commented out that for the first value into repeat, we put the number 1. And then at these various media queries, we put different numbers. Like for the tablet view, we have 2, right? So that means we want 2 columns of tablet view. And then here for the desktop view, we put 3. So 3 columns on the desktop view. But basically, by specifying autofill here, we're handing control over to CSS Grid, and we're basically saying, you figure out how much space we have and fit as many of these columns in as you can. Right, so it knows at this view, at desktop view, it can fit in 3 columns. Once it gets down here, it's automatically calculating that it can fit 2 columns. And here, it's automatically calculating that it can only fit in 1 column. But how is CSS Grid making that determination? Like, we know that this outer container is set up to take 90% of the width of the viewport, so that's clear. But in order for CSS Grid to be able to figure out how many cards can fit into a row, in other words, how many number of columns we can have, we need to specify that here in the second argument to the repeat function. And remember, in the commented out version, we were doing 1FR. So we were saying no matter whether you have 1 column, 2 columns, or 3 columns, we want each of these cards to divide the available space equally, to be 1 fraction of it. But in order for us to use grid template columns in a way that allows us to do this automatic responsiveness, where we're changing from 1 card to 2 cards per row to 3 cards per row, we need to specify a minimum and a maximum value. All right, so here the minimum value is 300 pixels. We're saying, at the very minimum, we need a card to be at least 300 pixels wide. However, if the space is available, just make it 1 fraction. So, in other words, here, at this screen width, we have enough total width that we can fit 3 cards in a row and still satisfy that minimum width for a card of 300 pixels. Let's examine a card to see its current width. So here it's 363, so it's more than 300. Because we have that available width, Grid is saying, okay, well, just make each one of these cards 1 fraction of the available width. But for example, what if we set the minimum value in the min-max to be 500 pixels and save? Well, now you can see the result, right? If we have a minimum requirement for each card to be at least 500 pixels, well, now Grid can't automatically fit 3 of those cards in a row. So it drops the 3rd card down to its own row. Right, so I can set the minimum value to be sort of a comfortable setting, where it's enough for the contents of the card to be able to be displayed in a readable manner, but yet it's not too large so that where if we had a mobile device that had a small screen width, the card still wouldn't be too wide. Or it would be narrow enough to display nicely on the mobile device. See you next time.